pause it till. Okay, so Adrienne has something to go over, but first I wanted to welcome everybody. Thank you guys so much for being here, taking time out of your days, especially a big, big thank you to the panelists who are here. And we are so incredibly lucky to have such amazing people like them. So thank you once again to them, and thank you to, just anyone else who's attending for being here and listening to their amazing experiences. So yeah, without further ado, Adrienne has something that she needs to go into, so I'll hand it over to her.
Yeah, so hi everyone and welcome to our panel. We're so excited that you're here. I'm just going to be sharing a little bit of our structure and then going over our sponsors for today and then finally our panelists, and then we can get started. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. Alrighty. So here, me. Okay. Welcome everyone to the Neuro's research panel discussion event. So it is currently 10:05. We're going to start the panel, and I'm just going to give a quick introduction about who we are at the Neuro and our mission. So the Neuro is a student-led organization, and our goal is to really promote education and exposure to the fields of neuroscience, psychology, and mental health among students. We focus on high school students, but we also welcome university students to be part of our organization. We have a lot of projects and initiatives that we do here at the Neuro. Something that we've done is partnerships with other organizations that are similar to us, such as Molecular Network. If anyone from Molecular Network is here today, then hi. Our next thing that we have is the Neuro Journal, in which we give students the ability to write and research their own articles about neuroscience and psychology. We have our first issue coming up, so that's really exciting. We also have webinars, workshops, and other online events like the one you are attending today. And we really try to reach out to other PhD students, professors, and researchers in our fields. And finally, we have networking opportunities with other researchers and students to help get our students involved and interested in neuroscience and psychology. So with that, I kind of went over these initiatives again, but these are just kind of the 4 pillars of our organization. And I know we have a lot of students here today, and some of you guys are part of the Neuro and already, and some of you guys aren't, but it would be really exciting for you guys to join. We have a lot of things you can work on in our organization and a lot of events you can attend. So we'll be having some closing remarks, and if you join our organization after this panel discussion event, then we wholeheartedly invite you. So today's event sponsors are TaskAid and Magoo sponsors for providing what they have provided for us. So first, TaskAid is a unified collaboration hub and remote workspace that helps manage projects and teams. You can create tasks, share notes, and chat in real time. So this is a really useful tool for other organizations to use. They have generously donated 5 free 1-year TaskAid unlimited accounts, and we're going to be selecting randomly through our participants through a raffle, and we'll notify our winners later. We also have Magoosh, which is an online test preparation and study abroad counseling company. They provide audio and video lessons, practice test questions, and online email support. And they will be giving away 2 SAT and ACT test preparation subscription giveaways. So any of our attendees can win these sweet prizes. So just look out for that. And Yeah, good luck, I guess. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists today, which they're the star of our show. um, so if I'm going to just read off the names, and if each panelist could just give a short 1 to 2 minute intro when I call their name, about their department, their specific field in neuroscience and psychology, something interesting about themselves, or something they want to say to our audience to start it off. Um, no need to go into too big of specifics. That's where our panel questions will come in. But so if Dr. Andre Fenton could introduce himself, that would be great. You can just unmute, and yeah.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So I'm a neuroscientist. I study memory, and memory is a very broad topic that can be talked about at many different levels of trying to understand the biology of memory and the psychology of memory. And I try and do all of it. So I work at the level of genetics, the molecular biology of memory, the molecules that we think cause memories to persist, how those molecules interact in circuits built by neurons and change the functioning of those circuits, so the electrophysiology in those circuits, and in how brain areas defined by those collections of circuits interact with each other to compute the information that we think we are storing as we have experiences. So all of this falls under the notion of the process of memory, which is what I try and study at many different levels of biology. Which I have to say has forced me to recognize that almost anything turns out to be a valuable way of looking at a problem as complicated as memory. And so I have learned over time that in many ways the disciplines that we traditionally recognize, it's like physics or engineering or mathematics or psychology or neuroscience or sociology or even history, all of these have relevance to the kind of problem that many neuroscientists work on, including me. And so I'm very happy to speak with and discuss really about any matter. And that's one of the things you'll find about me. I'm very curious for this very specific reason to dialogue with anybody on almost any matter.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. Next, I'm going to call on Dr. Ann Hart. Just give a quick introduction if you could. Thank you very much.
Sure, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a neuroscientist, and I think of that as writ large in the sense of my lab studies both sleep and fatigue, as well as neurodegenerative diseases like ALS or frontotemporal dementia or Huntington's disease. These are two different areas we study, not an intersectional thing. What's interesting about neuroscience, and this is sort of something that Andre said, is that it's such a broad field. You can tackle problems from so many directions. So we mostly use genetics as our primary tool, working on little worms that are like the size of a period in a sentence. But because the animals on the planet are all very similar in how their neurons function, the things we discover about sleep or fatigue or about neurodegenerative diseases in little tiny worms are frequently same things that are going on in larger animals and humans as well. So basic principles and mechanisms is what we try to get at. We're also, I'm going to say, very collaborative in the sense we collaborate with biochemists, we collaborate with people who do behavior, computational neuroscientists. There's many ways to go at a problem, and you can't be a specialist in everything. And so it's great to work with other people, come from different places, different perspectives, and different expertises to tackle these problems and others. You said, tell us a little about ourselves, and we can do more on that. None of us, I hear, know are one-dimensional. You know, I have a family, I like fiction, science fiction, I like birds and everything else. So we have real lives hidden behind our scientific lives here too. Don't worry.
All right, thank you so much. Next, we have Dr. Moore.
Good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to spend some time with you guys this Saturday afternoon. My name is Dr. Moore. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Neurology at Duke. However, my background, as the other two panelists, are neuroscience. I'm a neuroscientist trained in the field of neurobiology, yet I work in the Department of Neurology. The focus of my lab is the sensory transduction of pain and itch. And we focus on trip ion channels. These are ion channels that reside in almost every tissue. And I like to tell people, like, the trip channels to me are rather interesting because a lot of the things that we eat or we use are actually trip channels or receptors for them, like garlic, ginger, just random things that the old wives used to cure things back in the day. We are actually beginning to notice that trip channels are actually involved in a lot of these. So that's one thing I usually point out to my students early on, that, we've been treating diseases with these things for a long time, and we did not know we were targeting trip channels. So I'm interested in pain in general. Lately, I've switched a little one of my focus to migraine pain, as I'm a migraine sufferer. And so I get to study migraine pain. A lot of the work, we use mice, we use rodent models in my lab. So we know how to model migraine in animals. And however, I'm also interested in other diseases. Any pain phenomena I'm actually interested in. I'm interested in finding out both the molecular and cellular mechanisms underlying chronic pain, and also itch, because itch and pains actually use the same receptors, same channels, similar pathway, and we're yet to actually decipher what's the major difference between itch and pain. We are still working on that. We have some clues, yes, but they use the same pathway. So we are studying the chronic itch and chronic pain. And we use animal behavior, as I mentioned. We also use genetics, molecular and cellular biology. We use advanced imaging. We use viral and optogenetic approaches. So we use, what you're going to realize about neuroscientists is we do not have in particular one thing that we do. We collaborate with people from every field. And that's what I feel like makes neuroscience great, that we could reach out to computational scientists to compute how the brain, how neurons talk to each other. We reach out to, geneticists. So we use every aspect of science there is. You need to know a lot of physics, math, to the neuroscience. So that's, I'm really excited about neuroscience on a whole. That's what got me into it. And I'm hoping that you guys would, as we talk, that you guys would also get excited about neuroscience as we are.
Great, thank you so much for that. Next, we have one of our PhD students, Miss Fiak.
Hey everyone, my name is Kimberly Fiak. I'm a PhD student. I'm actually a little bit different. I'm in experimental pathology. So I have a background in neuroscience. I have a bachelor's degree in neuroscience, but I am really interested in disease and how disease processes work. So I decided to pursue pathology, which is the study of disease. And I work in a neuropathology lab where I study brain disease. We look at both like neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease, but also neurodevelopment and how changes in Alzheimer's disease can maybe be backtracked in development, or how we can look at normal functions during development and better treat disease as people age. So that's kind of what my lab does. We use as everyone mentioned, a combination of all sorts of things. Particularly, I work with stem cells, and we create three-dimensional organoids, which are essentially like little brains in a dish, and we can use those as a model to study what happens during development to neurons. We can also use them for aging, and they're a really cool model system that is starting to get a lot more traction in the field. We also run our very own brain bank or tissue repository. So I'm learning all sorts of things about that, how to consent cases, how to cut brains, how to store them, how to do pathologic workups, and so on and so forth. So that's a really cool part of my lab that I really enjoy. And I will leave you with this caveat that when I get a PhD, I will not be a pathologist. Pathologists have medical degrees. I always want to caveat that because neuropathology is really cool and being a neuropathologist is really cool, but that's not necessarily what I do. So I kind of talk about what that's like, but that's not 100% what I do because I don't have a medical degree. So I just want to caveat that there's kind of two ways you can go in pathology. You can do more clinical, which would be diagnosing patients. You can do research. You can do both, but I'm doing much more of a research focus.
Wow, thank you for that. Next we have Dr. Spencer.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. My name is Sade Spencer. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Pharmacology at the University of Minnesota. And pharmacology is sort of a discipline that spans many disciplines. But as other people on the panel have stated, I identify as a neuroscientist first, and that's what my background and training was in. My PhD was in neuroscience. But as I said, pharmacology is many things. And so the department that I'm in sort of has a subgroup of us that are really neuroscience focused. And then there's a subgroup of us that have a large cancer biology focus. And then there's a subgroup of us that are really focusing on these more basic cell signaling questions that could kind of span across many different things. And so my lab in particular is interested in studying the mechanisms of reward in substance use disorders. And so we do that in a preclinical model. And so I work with rats on a daily basis, and we are able to do a number of different, we use a number of different behavioral tasks and do a lot of behavioral pharmacology with these models. But one of sort of our bread and butter models that we use is the drug self-administration paradigm. So we're able to do a surgery to introduce a catheter and allow rats to self-administer drugs of abuse on their own so that we can then study what's going on in the brain at various time points, sort of along the cycle of addiction, so to speak. And so we're interested in kind of looking at the trajectory of substance use disorders and seeing what brain changes are occurring at different time points, and if there are things that we can do to sort of interfere in any of those time points that may lead us to better treatment strategies for various substance use disorders in the future.
Great, thank you so much. And finally, we have Ms. Anyanso.
Sorry, I was having trouble with my mouse.
Oh.
So my name is Vanessa Nyonso. I am a PhD student at the University of Minnesota. It seems I am the lone psychologist in training here. So my research area is actually my research interests are specifically in Black mental health, Black women's mental health, and how being a member of multiple marginalized groups can impact a person's mental health and how they cope with it. However, due to the pandemic, a lot of my research plans have been pushed aside. And the main research thing I'm doing right now is I'm actually helping my advisor manage a study on how COVID-19 and everything that's happened within this past crazy year has been affecting our university community. And within that, I have been specifically asking questions and analyzing and researching about the effect of George Floyd and the unrest and a lot of things regarding that on the mental health of people. And it's a really interesting data set because we have 6 waves of data. So we're able to see over time, for our third wave of data, George was killed the day before we launched that survey. sort of thing. And even now we're collecting data right now. And as we know, on Sunday night, but Monday, Dante Wright was killed just like 10 minutes from me. So it's been an interesting time to be collecting data right now. All that to say, yeah.
Yeah, great. All right, thank you so much to all of our panelists for the introductions. I'm going to stop share right now. And before we begin our panel questions, I just wanted to remind our participants that your questions, please put them in the open chat, not private chat, and we'll get to them after the first. Yeah, Barbara, we love the introductions. Anyways, we'll be touching upon our attendee questions after the host share the prepared questions. And please, so just please put any of your questions as you go along and we'll get to them when we get to them. So with that, I'm going to start off our panel discussion with the question, what does a normal day in your life look like relating to your career and studies? And so for each of these questions, I'll have about maybe like 3 panelists answer just for time. So whoever wants to speak up first, go ahead. I encourage any of you to answer the question. So once again, that's what does a normal day in your life look like relating to your career and studies?
I can start us off if no one minds. As a PhD student, I probably will have a very different normal day than someone who's a professor, so I can kind of give that perspective. I love this question because there really is no such thing as a normal or typical day. When you're a scientist, every day is so different, depending on how well your experiments worked the day before, or depending on what point in your PhD or your studies you're at. You know, first year students are going to have a different typical day than like a 3rd or 4th year student. I got my master's degree first before starting my PhD. So that kind of clumped with my PhD. So I'm really technically a 3rd year student, even though I'm a 1st year PhD student. So I don't really have classes anymore. My typical day is usually feeding my cells or taking care of my cell culture experiments, doing experiments at the bench, whether that be a Western blot to look at protein in a sample, or doing IF, so using immunofluorescence to make pretty pictures essentially of proteins in my cells. I also help with the brain bank. So some days we'll get donated brains come in and I'll help cut those and store those, or I'll work with my PI who's a neuropathologist to look at cases and kind of get an idea of what's going on with people around me, what different diseases might look like under the microscope, and get a sense of how I can kind of communicate what we see with clinical symptoms that other doctors might notice. So that's kind of a wide range of what I do in my typical day. But most of my day doing cell culture experiments, that's the majority of my day would be cell culture research. But a lot of people who work with animals would probably say that's more of what their day is spent with. We don't work with animals, so I'm really in awe of people that do, because they kind of scare me a little bit.
So I can jump in. My day looks very different, and it looks very different depending on the stage of my career that we talk about. So when I was a graduate student or a young professor, I spent most of my day making measurements and perfecting how to make those measurements in the systems that I was studying. It turns out that those measurements were not very important per se. So I'm an expert electrophysiologist, but I subsequently have learned to be an expert biochemist, and whatever thing I needed to learn is what I learned I needed to learn, and I would do that. With time, however, what has happened, and there was an interesting time in my career when I liked to demonstrate to everybody in my lab that I was the best person in the lab to do that particular thing, because I was, and I was, I have very good hands and knowledge of how to do things and so on. And then I realized that time passed and I was no longer the best person at being able to do things. And in fact, the best way for our lab to make progress was to introduce brand new things that I had no idea of how to do, but I could understand what they could accomplish. And so today, most of my day involves talking to other people, trying to convince them to do things that I don't myself know how to do, but convince them to do things in the right way. Somehow my job is mostly a quality control in terms of ideas. So I can talk to somebody about something arbitrary and try to understand what they're essentially trying to do, try and guide them in ways so that they're making the sort of the precise micro judgments that they have to make in order to accomplish that thing. And my job is to make sure that we keep in mind the big picture direction that all of this research and all of the effort is moving towards. And part of that is involved, or what's an essential part of that is to be able to communicate that. And sometimes we communicate as if we're psychologists. Sometimes we communicate as if we're people developing technology. Sometimes we communicate as if we're entrepreneurs. Sometimes we communicate as if we're physiologists. Sometimes like biochemists. And my day is just full of having those different conversations, really about the same thing. But if you listen to the language and the choice of words, although the essence is the same, the vocabulary is completely different because it depends on, are we trying to raise money for the laboratory? Are we trying to write a paper? Are we trying to figure out why the experiments aren't working? That kind of thing. But that is what eventually becomes the most valuable thing that I can do in the laboratory rather than make all the measurements. So that's been the evolution, at least in my case.
That's really cool. Yeah, I didn't know that there was like that. Like I thought it was just being a scientist. Well, to me, I'm not like experienced, I guess. But to me, it seemed like being a scientist was just, oh, I go do this and I do the same thing and I go do my experiment, then I go write and do more paperwork, right? That's what it seemed like to me. But all the panelists are all shaking their heads. No, I mean, I think this is like some great insight as to what careers actually look like because I know a lot of kids like me don't have any experience. So, like I have one audience question that like I wanted to answer before we went any further. So, what are some typical or not typical, just like what are some jobs or careers related to going down the research route in neuroscience? Like maybe that might be yours or like other people's, but if you could just give us some insight into that, that would be amazing.
Well, here, I'll tell you about some people in my lab. So a postdoc in my lab who's very talented, has a biomedical engineering degree. He's always been interested in making practical things with what we do in the laboratory. So he was interested, and we founded a company that was intended to make meditation a tool to help people to learn to meditate. It made sense, and it doesn't really matter the details, but he's just decided through that effort, and because of what he knew about neurophysiology in animals, he just joined a new pharmaceutical company that's trying to make antidepressant and anti-anxiety drugs from psychedelic compounds. And their goal is to take these psychedelic compounds that are easily abused and remove the thing that makes them hallucinogenic, make molecular modifications to try and reduce the hallucinogenic properties, for example, and the dissociative properties, to retain, as an example, the neuroplasticity properties that might confer resilience or some kind of benefit. And so just to show you that this would not be something easily planned, but he turns out to be the ideal person for that kind of an effort because he is capable, he's very computationally well trained, and he's capable of looking at the electrical activity in those animals in relation to those compounds. And so that becomes a super important platform for drug development for that class of drugs. And so he's just joined their pharmaceutical company, and that is what his research and professional effort will be for the next while. So it's a mixture of entrepreneurship and the neurophysiology that he's an expert in, directed at a problem. And I think that's just to summarize, I can give you the same sort of story about other people, including myself. What we end up doing is a job that's targeted mostly at solving a problem. And however that problem gets solved, we usually learn to adapt the tools to solve the problem, because that's a lot of the training in neuroscience is around figuring out how to solve a problem given a variety of tools.
And I'll jump in and give another, give another answer, related answer. I know a lot of people that have completed PhDs in neuroscience and then gone on to work at companies where now they're in the position of connecting those of us that remain in research with those tools. So they are the representatives that will, you know, demo things or help you introduce new things into your laboratory that you indeed don't have any idea how to do, but you want to bring it in because you know that this is a technique you need to get something done. And so I've seen a lot of people successfully transition into something like that. So they remain very close to the research and they're helping people achieve their goals, but they're not necessarily actually answering any questions themselves anymore.
Yeah, I was just going to add quickly to that too. I think, especially as a PhD student, when you're in academia, a lot of the push is to become a principal investigator or run your own lab. It's becoming more and more common to get exposure to other career paths, particularly one that I've been kind of toying with the idea for myself is to become a core director. So a lot of universities or academic institutions will run facilities that do all of the specimen processing or house all the brains or the organs or do something like that. So they run a core so that researchers themselves don't have to take the time to do every single step of the process, like get the tissue, cut the tissue, put it on slides, so on and so forth. But that's still one way to be involved in research. If you're managing a core, you're helping researchers essentially speed up the process so that they can complete their research faster.
Dr. Hart, go ahead.
There's also, all those things are absolutely things people do. The other thing people have seen them go from my lab is to work with foundations or other nonprofit agencies. So someone from my lab works at the ALS Association, started out with like communicating to patients and families, and moved into helping the association organize grants. And so, and other people work at within the university working on either fundraising, organizing, or grants to help either the students or the faculty, either to achieve their goals or to get research done or communicating between. So there's a whole spectrum of things that are out there for people with PhDs in neuroscience.
Thank you so much for that. And before we move on to the next question, if either Ms. Anyanso or Dr. Moore wanted to add on to either of the first two questions, that would be great.
We still have an hour. It's okay. if they don't have anything to say.
Yeah.
Okay.
No pressure.
Well, the first, I had something to say about my daily activities, because one thing I tell people when they ask me what it's like to be a professor, I was like, it's like being a small business owner. And because at this point you get into it and you think that okay, you'll just be doing science, but it's almost like running a business. You're responsible for writing your own grants. So that means you have to that's like getting your own capital, get money to run the labs. Then the next thing you have to do is when you do the experiment, you have to do all the writing up. You have to do all the hiring of your staff in the lab. So I'm actually going through it because I'm a new assistant professor. I'm actually in the process of hiring more staff, and that's very tedious of, because you're trying to find the right fit and having people work with you. It's similar at this point. I did not know I'll be like running a small business, but it's literally like running a small business because you have to manage your budget, your lab budget, manage people, manage the experiments. Yeah, so that's the part I wanted to add, that think of becoming a principal investigator as almost like running a business. Except you get to enjoy fun science also and get those rewards. Andre, you look like you had something to say.
I was going to say, so I think you're absolutely right. It's in fact not just a small business, it's a small startup business.
Yes.
They're really no difference. And I've run a number of startup businesses. It's the same set of skills.
So
Yeah.
that's part. Yeah, go ahead.
And I'd say the only thing I would add, not at least on the professor end, but like on the grad student end. So my program, and I'm in a counseling psychology program. So in addition to classes and research, I also have clinical responsibilities. So added on top of that, I see clients and like write case notes and like meet with my supervisor. And like, in addition to all that, I also manage like undergrads as well and help mentor. So it's a lot of different hats I go through in the course of a day or a week. Yeah.
Thank you so much for those answers. That was really insightful, very helpful to our participants. I'm going to move on to our next question, and then we'll get into some of the other the participant questions. And this is kind of geared more to the PhD students because you probably remember better. But what kind of neuroscience or psychology related work or research opportunities did you pursue in high school, and how did you kind of develop that academic path later in university?
If you pursued any research opportunities in high
Yeah.
school.
I can go first. So I actually didn't pursue any science activities at all in high school, which is really, when I talk to high school students now, there are so many opportunities to be involved in. There's so much learning on social media. And I'm kind of jealous I didn't do that when I was in high school, but I did nothing. So don't be afraid if you go through all of high school and don't do anything. That's totally okay. That doesn't mean you can't pursue science. My first opportunity to do research was when I was an undergrad. The summer before I started, I did a special program through my university where I worked in a research lab for 10 weeks. And then I did a couple other internships when I was in undergrad. So my kind of big thing is, it's okay if you don't do anything sciencey until you get to college, or even until you're almost done with college and you're just figuring things out. Don't worry, you're not behind. There's no set timeline. You can do things at your own pace and discover things at your own pace. But if you're here, that's great. That means you're learning about neuroscience early, which is awesome. I applied to college as a neuroscience major, not even knowing what neuroscience was. So it's really cool that you're taking this opportunity now to learn and kind of figure out what things are right for you.
Yeah, and I would say pretty much the same thing. I actually have a podcast, the PH Diversity podcast, where I kind of talk about my journey to like where I am and so on and so forth. And one of the things I highlighted in that is that like I did not know anything. I didn't even know you could do research as a psychologist, like nothing until maybe like my junior year of college. Like that's kind of like when I actually started doing things. So yeah, kind of going off like Miss Kimberly here, it's like, it's amazing that you guys are already like on the ball thinking about this now. But like at the same time, it's like don't freak out if you don't know what you're going to do yet, or like how you're going to get there, so on and so forth. Like I didn't know what I was doing until like halfway through my college experience and like still kind of bumbled my way along.
Yeah, that's so amazing. I mean, if you don't mind, would you please share the link to your podcast in the chat? I mean, I want to listen to it. I don't know about everybody else here, but
Yeah, I'll share the link to the website. I'll pull that up.
yeah, thank you so much.
I was just going to say too, I actually run now shameless plug, I run an Instagram account too to teach people about pathology, because it's not a very well-known field. And I talk about my PhD experience, my undergrad experience, and all that kind of stuff. So I can link that too if anyone's interested in learning more about pathology and how that kind of intertwines with neuroscience.
That's amazing, Miss Biak. Thank you. If anybody has any more plugs, panelists, if you guys want to go on any more plugs, go ahead. Now's the chance.
I don't have a plug, but I want to make an observation. You'll notice that a lot of us are really good and practice at communicating. So that's a skill that you can start working on, today. And it is a skill. It's not something that comes naturally to me, but it's something that I got better at over time. And in terms of I was a philosophy major when I went to college. Then I ended up with a neurobiology degree, and I had no idea what science was and had no intention of being a scientist when I graduated. And then I ended up becoming a neurophysiologist. So all because I was interested really in understanding, what's real. That's actually the problem I've always been interested in. And so what you're hearing from all of us is not to worry about the formalities of this, just like engage with something that interests you and follow that. And it's very likely with that plus some guidance, you will end up doing the kinds of things that you can ultimately do and call a career that's satisfying.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, you said that you were a philosophy major and then you went into, those are two completely different fields, but like I think that's a really good example of like lots of people think by the time they go into like ninth grade, I need to know what I'm gonna do and I have a plan set out. Like it doesn't have to be that. At the end of the day, you have to find your course in life, and that can be through a lot of career exploration. And I think, attending panels like this is a great way to like diversify your worldview, I guess, and learn more about different careers. So yeah, that's my little spiel. But so I wanted to ask to like the professors here, like because lots of people here are, looking to go into neuroscience in college. So what do you think would be the ideal candidate for like a student that you'd want to have? And like what sort of experiences should they try to collect? I know this kind of varies, but just wanted to get your opinions.
It's
Okay.
go ahead.
Oh yeah, adding to that, doesn't have to be student. It can be like an assistant or like an intern, anything like that. So someone that you would want to, I guess, bring by your side, just like that.
Yeah, it's interesting to ask that question because people come from very many different places and end up doing super well in the lab and doing research and loving it. So people start from very different places in what they know in their research experiences, whether they join my lab as a undergrad researcher or as after their undergrad, they work for a couple of years in the lab before going to grad school as a grad student. They do need to succeed. You need to be able to work with lots of different kinds of people. If you don't want to work with people from all kinds of backgrounds and all coming from different places and ask questions bravely and try to really understand stuff, this is not the career for you. They also need to be really willing to dig down and think about what they're doing. I mean, at some level, you're like, I'm sort of interested in this. I know enough to get by. No, when you really start asking questions about stuff, you really want to understand what you're doing. So if you have that level of intensity and commitment, you can be trained to do the rest of the stuff. I don't know, Andre and Vanessa, what do y'all think?
Vanessa, you go first.
Oh, but I'm not a professor. I'm just a student.
Okay. I could go.
Sade, anybody?
I could also go. For students, I usually tell the students actually the skills. I'd rather retrain you when you come in the lab. We teach you what you need to do. The skills we look for is like, as she said, strong personal traits like character, trustworthiness, willing to work hard, and as she said, be curious about science. A lot of the things that we do in the lab, even if you had knowledge about it elsewhere, we still want to train you how we do it in our lab. So that's to me, I mean, you want to have a little bit of skill set, but most of the skills in my lab is taught. So I think personal traits are more important to me. Be willing to work hard, to dedicate yourself to the task, willing to, as Dr. Hart said, some scientific curiosity, be willing to think outside the box, be willing to solve problems that are not just like, according to like what everybody is doing, but like, okay, how could I tweak this to solve this problem? How could I, even some people like, you find ways to invent new things pretty much. Sometimes as neuroscientists, as I say, we use so many different things from different fields and we repurpose them for our purposes. And so how could I use this piece of equipment that they use over there? How could I tweak it a little bit to get it to work here? And that type of curiosity we look for. So it's not like, okay, you having internships and having done some, been in a lab somewhere, it's helpful, but it's not like the primary thing that we look for. Sometimes it's actually harmful when they've already been to somewhere else and they've been screwed up with different bad, so sometimes it's, I think, more personal drive that I look for, and that for my lab.
Yeah, very similar in mine. I really try and identify people who have analytical skills for solving problems. And there's so many ways to present that. So if you have research experience, I'll talk to you about your research experience, but I frankly don't really care about your research experience. What I'd like to know is how you thought about your research experience, how you grew during your research experience. If you can articulate the problem that you did and you were tackling and failed at and succeeded at in your research experience, that's really valuable to me. If you explain to me what you actually did in your research experience, that now you're not doing very well in your interview. So I think, as you heard, every laboratory, every PI has their own way of doing things, and they want you ultimately to adopt that way, or a way that is consistent with that way, whatever it is. And so the key thing is to have somebody who's really motivated and has grit. Somebody who, because you will meet in my lab problems that you will not be able to solve. And I won't be able to tell you how to solve them, but they're going to be solvable. And in the end, you have to find the solutions for them and know how to navigate the solution space. Some will be dead ends and some will be successes, but you have to have the perseverance and the tenacity to do that. And so we all try, I think, to find people who are like that. And there's no degree in that. There's no particular training program that you can point to and say, well, I have a degree in that. It's in philosophy, or it's in neurobiology, or it's in physics, or it's in this kind of engineering or not. You just have to have that, show that you have that set of character traits, if you will. And again, I'm not sure you get born with them, but they're certainly learnable. And you can learn them in almost any discipline that you pick up.
You could learn them cooking. Like, I'm going to do all these things to try and figure out how to make like the best spice bread. And like, I'm try this. No, I've got to make the hot water warm hot. You explain this to me in a lab interview, and I'd be like, yeah, come troubleshoot things in my lab.
I mean, I do this almost every year. I pick a thing and I make it 50 times at home for my family to try and perfect it. That's just like, I get pleasure for doing that, right? So I can make a bunch of dishes and I know exactly how to make them in that particular oven, in that particular situation, because that's just my personality.
It's so funny because my PhD mentor said that to me. She was like, most scientists tend to be great cooks because it's almost the same discipline that we have to learn to put things together and troubleshoot and make it just as perfect. And yeah, because I love to cook and she loved to cook also. So yes.
Me too.
That's so cool. I mean, you wouldn't think that that's what you'd be looking for, but that's definitely, I think, what you mentioned about honesty. And I don't know if you guys like have kids or what's the deal, but when I was a kid, I always used to watch Curious George about this really curious monkey who literally, yeah, some of you are laughing at me, but yeah, I used to watch Curious George. And Curious George, I think, is a great like way to kind of sum it all up. He's really honest. He never lies. He always does what he's supposed to do. And he's always really, I wouldn't say nosy, but he kind of is. And he's always looking to solve problems, right? So I think that's like that's definitely what I thought of.
Yeah, and I really liked our panelists' cooking analogy. Personally, I don't have much experience cooking, but maybe I should give that more of a try. And yeah, so our panelists were talking about kind of like having this natural curiosity and like persevering through any failures that you may encounter in your research. And I think that actually perfectly ties in with one of our participant questions, which is about how making mistakes is part of learning. And they wanted to ask, like, what kind of mistakes or like failures have you encountered in your research, and what lessons have you learned from it?
I wanted to comment on that really quick and kind of harken back to the last question too, because I feel like that's a thing that I look for in people in my lab, is that they, I guess, almost have the confidence to make mistakes. I feel like being afraid to make mistakes can really hold you back. And so being willing to, I don't know, try something new or go forward enough, knowing that you could make a mistake, but like I'm there to not be mad at you, but we'll learn from it together. That's been something that I feel like is something that I look for: the willingness to make mistakes, but then also the humility to come to me when you've made a mistake and how we could learn from it together. And then on my part, the openness of myself, of being able to tell the people that are in my lab when I've made a mistake and how I've learned from it, and we can all learn from it together. Just like we are all humans and we do all make mistakes. And I mean, I feel like 8 things out of 10 don't necessarily work the way that we think they work. But a great thing about being a scientist is that a lot of the time, even I have a hypothesis, right? But I kind of don't care if I'm right, as long as I am confident in the answer. So, like, what is a mistake then? If it doesn't really matter if you prove yourself correct, you still learn something either way.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that I think the it's the only word I can find, propensity to learn. That is something that's really important, I think. So another question that we had was, what do you believe is the most challenging and rewarding parts of like your job on a daily basis?
Right now, the most challenging part is the number of Zoom meetings.
Yes.
That's definitely, I think that's a challenging part of any job at this
I
point.
think for me, I'll go as a neuroscientist, well, as a PI, having to learn to deal with rejection. Because most papers you submit, it never get accepted on the first submission. There will always be reviews. You submit a grant. If most grants are never funded on the first submission either. So I mean, it's a lifestyle where you gonna be able, something's gonna get rejected, and you're gonna have to go back to the drawing board, redo it, retool, and then, but you can't just stay down. You have to get back up, work on it, and then resubmit. So I think that's one of the challenges as a scientist, is learning to deal with rejection and not let it knock you down, or you go home and you mope. But you'll probably have to go home and mope for a day or two. but don't stay moping. You get up and you move on, and you, I think as with anything in life, but I think that was one of the challenges that I had to learn to deal with is sometimes, and not take it personally. It's not like they don't like you per se. It's, you know, they have suggestions on a paper and it's not published. Okay, you have to change who you submit it to, or your grant's not funded on the first submission. We tweak it and you resubmit. And but the positives is when you do get a paper published, when your work is out there and people are referencing your work and people are like, oh yeah, Dr. Moore did this and did that. That's the reward, that you've made some contribution to science, you've made an overall impact. So there will be lots, and I must say lots of rejection. During my PhD, I figured out why they call it research, because you're searching and searching and searching and searching. And I was like, oh, this is why it's called research, because you don't do anything once. You don't even do it twice, 10 times. Sometimes you do it over and over again, just tweaking something here and there in search of what you're investigating. But the key is not to just give up. You just keep at it and keep going. And there are highs when you actually, make an impact in the scientific community.
Yeah.
Oh,
Nice.
sorry, go ahead.
I totally agree with what you said there. I'm going to say it shifts across career. When I was younger, like a technician before going to grad school, or even as a postdoc, I think the biggest challenge was actually imposter syndrome and not realizing that, the lack of self-confidence that you could do. Now that I have gray hairs, that's not so much of the challenge. Now it's more, how can I best for each of my mentees or my students or even the junior falcon, can I best help them individually and figure out what they need? So it shifts across careers.
I was going to say, I think for me as a student right now, one of the most challenging parts that I didn't really expect with grad school is balance. As a student, balancing being, a full-time scientist. People don't realize that doing your PhD is a full-time job. It's not like the same as student life, like when you're in high school and you go to school and then you come home and you have all these extracurricular activities and things like that. You're working a full-time job and going to class, and it is a lot of work. So balancing your personal life with that and making time to do things that you love outside of the lab. It's totally encouraged to have hobbies. Science can't be your whole life. You need to enjoy other things to be a really, well-rounded and happy person. So that has been a really big challenge that I've faced, especially in this graduate school phase of my life. But then the most rewarding thing is talking to students. I've really recently gotten into science communication and talking to people about my journey, and there's nothing that feels better than when someone's inspired by your work or inspired by what you do, and that makes them want to pursue your field. Like, that is by far the most rewarding thing that will ever happen to me as a scientist, is someone coming to me and saying, you inspired me to pursue this too. So I think that's really, really rewarding.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So for me, and again, it shifts over time, but one of the biggest challenges, and it's connected to imposter syndrome and it's connected to all the rejection and such, is, my job is to decide on a direction that we're going to pursue and then get other people to follow that direction and explore it. And so there's a lot of responsibility that goes with that. And you don't get an answer for a long time. And so for me, part of the challenge is to be confident enough and steady enough to not steer erratically as you're pursuing that thing that is a 3 to 5 to 10-year program, because other people's livelihoods and well-being depend on it, and they're not necessarily succeeding or seeing that they're succeeding. And so there's a real tension there. Do you abandon that crazy notion that you had developed or had caused these other people to go down the garden path or not? And so the really difficult thing is once you go far enough down the path, you really have to either maintain but steer with true leadership. And I find that very, very challenging. But at the same time, it's the most rewarding part, because eventually you get to some end, or you get to some distance along that path, and you realize, oh, wow, I had no idea this was actually going to turn out this way. It's usually surprising. And what is particularly fulfilling and what you can recognize is how much your trainees, the people that you're working with, have transformed along that way. And that is truly the most satisfying thing. It almost doesn't matter who reads the papers or not, in a sense, but when you figure out that you really actually understand something, and somebody has, and you can see their mind change and their person change. You know, my wife, who is not a scientist, has run into some of my trainees on the street or just seen them and said, oh my God, I saw her walking down the street and she's a different person. You can tell from a distance. She's walking in a different way in the world. That is an incredibly satisfying feeling. And it makes all of the uncertainty and all of the stress in trying to guide that path in some sense worth it.
Yeah. Wow, that was like really inspirational, like talking about how someone can grow so much from their research and kind of just like the learning process throughout. I thought that was very inspiring, and I hope our panelists did, or our participants did as well. I kind of wanted to ask, who were your guys's like personal inspirations, either within or outside your field, that kind of inspired your work or inspired your academic journey?
Yeah, I guess I can go first. I would say like my inspiration is like my mentor now, who not my grad school mentor, although he's also dope, but like the lab I worked in at undergrad. Cause I think, as I mentioned before, growing up, so my parents are Nigerian. So I'm like a first generation immigrant kid here. And so growing up, okay, so psychologists, I only knew psychologists as like therapists. I didn't fully understand that there was also like a research component too. And then like once I kind of got a handle, like, okay, there's psychologists that do research, I was like, okay, but it's really only like old white men that do research. So I guess there's not really a place for me there. But my first Black and female, my first Black professor, who was a Black lone professor, was one of my psychology professors whose lab I ended up working in. And she is a social psychologist and does a lot of work on like discrimination and intersectionality and intergroup relations and things like that. And it was like the first time, one, that I had seen someone that looked like me within this institution, and also the fact that she was doing research on things that I thought were important and things I had seen in my own life that I'm like, oh, this is worthy of academic study. Like I could do this. So I would say like, yeah, she's my inspiration. I still like consult and talk with her today, but like she is like the reason I'm here and even thought there was a place for me.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing that you had like such a great inspiration. I mean, I don't even know, like I think the research field has become a lot more diversified nowadays, but I could only imagine like how it must have been back then. So like a lot of audience members have been like asking me how can like people go about getting research experience in high school, in college, and how do you think, like, what are the benefits that people could get from getting research experience so young?
I guess I can start because did this not too long ago. I think looking for internships is a really great way in college to get experience. I think the biggest advantage, as some of our professor panelists had talked about, that they don't necessarily look for people who have research experience, but more personal qualities. I think the advantage of doing an internship is figuring out if research is right for you. So a lot of people don't know whether or not research is a career for them. They don't really know what being a scientist means. Totally understandable. It's not very intuitive. So getting an internship is really for you to figure out, can I do this for the rest of my life? Do I enjoy working in a lab? Do I enjoy working with animals or people? Or do I enjoy, computational stuff rather instead of wet bench stuff? So I think that's really the biggest advantage. It's great to have the experience. You can talk about it when you're applying for grad school, but it's more important for you to figure out, is this the path that I want to follow? Do I like this type of research? And getting exposure to different fields within neuroscience, so because you can do more behavioral kind of neuroscience and work with people. You can do more mechanistic and work with animal models. There's all sorts of opportunities. So that's the best way to figure out kind of if it's right for you. And I honestly, when I found internships, I just Googled it. Neuroscience summer internships and just looked. Most universities will probably have one. A lot of times they're paid. I would caution you not to do an unpaid one unless it's a really, really important thing for you and it's going to further you some way, because your time is valuable. And even as a student, you are worthy of being paid for your work. So I would caution you against unpaid internships, but Google is going to be your best friend, and finding different organizations, either through social media or local universities that are involved in neuroscience. A lot of times they'll present opportunities as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I mean, that's definitely, I mean, a lot of people are like struggling with paid and unpaid internships and like personally college applications, right? I'm a high school student, so college applications is something that's looming on everyone's minds. And I think that, I think getting the experience and figuring out whether you're right for the space more so than like actually doing research, it's more the experience and how that changes you as a person. I think like all our panelists have talked about. I think that is really the most important thing, and what you learn and what you take away from that. So, my next question would be, what do you think the future of the neuroscience field or the research field would look like? And especially, since like COVID, how do you think it'll change in the future? And what do you think like students like going into the field in the future should be aware of?
Mm.
Go ahead, Dr. Fenton.
So I have to leave shortly, so I'll jump in. One of the things that I have appreciated with COVID is, and I got involved in a couple of COVID projects, not at all neuroscience, but pulmonology, making ventilators and tests. The thing that I think COVID has taught a lot of us is that you can solve problems very quickly, which is not what we traditionally have done. And so what I imagine, though I can't see into the future, but I imagine that there's going to be, because there's evidence of it, that problems can be solved and tackled on a much faster time scale than we traditionally have thought about. And it may be more efficient to try to solve big problems and recognize that you failed in doing so, and then you move on or you change your way of doing that. And so I suspect, I can't be sure of this, but I suspect there's going to be a flavor of that in who provides for funding and how we use that funding going forward. Because we've had such an impressive experience in COVID of solving some pretty big problems incredibly fast, like, an order of magnitude in years, 10 years faster than you traditionally would have expected. And the other piece of that I think came with that is we did all of this incredibly collaboratively, way, way more collaboratively than we ever did before, right? So you don't hoard the information, you disperse the information, you bring in as many people as possible, and you disseminate that information, even if it's not perfect, right away. Because if we work on things collectively, we can actually solve them. When they're important problems, we chose to do that. So I suspect we've learned from that. And in the future, you'll see a lot more collaborative, or there'll be pressure to do work in a much more collaborative, much more open way, and hopefully in a faster, or likely in a faster paced way. That's my guess.
Thank you so much for that insight, Dr. Fenton. And I know you probably have to go now. So I just wanted to thank you so much for your time and all of your answers. I'm sure our participants all benefited from that a lot. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. You're all very inspiring to me, so I appreciate you.
All right.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye.
Fenton.
All right. So for our remaining panelists, I know Dr. Fenton kind of touched into this with his COVID projects, but one of the questions I had was kind of how COVID has impacted your research and how you continue working in an online format, and what are some of like the challenges or benefits to that?
I can start. COVID has been hit at a really hard time for someone in my particular career stage. So as an assistant professor with not a super well established lab, it's been really difficult. A lot of things, we were shut down for a while, as probably a lot of places were. So there was a period of time when we just weren't doing any science. And so, you know, it became more about just kind of keep having these check-ins on Zoom and online just to kind of keep the cohesive nature of the lab and keep our little community together, even though there really wasn't that much we could do. We haven't been established long enough to have really big old data sets to go back to. We didn't have a ton of old papers to start writing or anything like that. So it really kind of one thing that I do hope comes out of this is that we are sensitive to the needs of scientists as people. And I just needed to think about what each of my team members needed as a person and understand that everyone was struggling through this in their own different way. And even when we could go back to lab, sort of tempering those expectations of sort of what to expect in terms of progress, because we're living and working and still under such difficult circumstances. And so just kind of like infusing a little bit more humanity maybe into this discipline is one thing that I hope comes out of it, and kind of how we handled it. But yeah, it's difficult because we're not supposed to be working at full capacity, and we're supposed to, do everything social distanced, but we're still at a stage where I'm still training people with a lot of hands-on things that are really difficult to maybe do in a video or something. So we're trying to, manage things safely, but still, make some progress as we move through this.
I would agree with Dr. Spencer in terms of like the giving people more flexibility and grace aspect of it. At least I know with like the undergrads that like I manage. I mean, I've always kind of been very flexible as long as as long as you communicate with me. I don't really care. Deadlines aren't real for the most parts, just like we'll get it done. But I would say like with this pandemic, I've been like much more flexible, and just being like, if it's like a really hard week and you just can't get anything done because of everything else, it's fine, just like let me know above and beyond all. And I know that's been helpful, like, okay, maybe we're not making progress as fast as we should, but at least I know I'm doing what I can to make sure my undergrads aren't like completely overwhelmed and burnt out, because I know not every professor provides them that grace. So like that's one aspect of it. And then I would say in terms of research, it's like kind of the opposite, because like as a psychologist, well, the type of psychology I do, a lot of like the research and stuff we do is through surveys and stuff. So like that hasn't necessarily really changed. And like pretty much I've just been managing and researching COVID since like this entire year. So it's just my entire research thing right now.
I'm going to say that there's very little good that came out of COVID, although there are a few silver linings. One of them would be more things can be virtual and reach more people. And we got better at that. And I guess that's something we can do going forward, even having, meeting people all over the planet, and maybe opening larger scientific conferences to, well, some people may attend virtually going forward too. So that's good. And also there's scientists are human, professors are human, they have lives, and it's been, depending on which institution you're at, as a scientist, you either saw your institution step up and say, yeah, you know, junior woman faculty member, you need this, you know, and you need this. So the level of support for people in their where they are coming from in their different places has been different. And so, and I guess that's a micro view of what's happened in the larger communities that we live in, is how different communities have and different institutions have stepped up or not. So there's been some revelations too.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And one other thing, as you said about conferences and Zoom, I think it sort of forced us to become more creative in how we adapt to certain situations. Like, for instance, Duke has a June summer internship program for high schoolers, and I'm hosting one of my first high school students, and it's going to be virtual. So I've never had a virtual student in my lab, and I'm hosting a high school student this summer. So I definitely going to have to be creative in finding research projects that could be done virtually, because a lot of my lab is animal work, cell work, and but I think that student will have fun, hopefully. But it forces us to become creative and in that way.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I know COVID has definitely impacted a lot of aspects of our life, and certainly your research, but hopefully, with the downward trends, we can go back to normal soon. So I know it's 11:20 a.m. Or my time, but we have about 10 minutes left, and just one final question I wanted to ask our panelists before wrapping up is just what is a piece of advice you would give to aspiring high school researchers or university students that are looking to pursue lab research or careers in neuroscience and psychology?
I would say that you're more than like research or being a scientist. I know some people have like touched on this beforehand, but at least for me, it's very important that I don't completely lose myself in my identity as a grad student. I like lifting. I have not been able to lift in a year due to this pandemic. But before, I'd spend 2 hours in the gym every day, and that was like my sacred time. In addition to that, I started this podcast because I wanted to do something for myself and put something back into the world. I also like writing creatively, and I do a web comic with one of my best friends where I write and she draws. And it's just at least very important for me to be even if I am a scientist, I can do other things too, and these are as important. Of course, there are only so many hours in a day. And of course, the bulk of my work has to go to my grad student and research responsibilities, but also knowing that I can protect a few hours to do things for myself, that I would say is very, very important, just because I feel like we get the message that when you're in grad school or in academia, it should be everything. You should eat, breathe, sleep this. And I'm I am actively rejecting that in a sense. Yeah.
I guess my advice for high school students is probably different than for undergrads. I agree with everything that you need to have a life, and you need to do things that let you, it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? So you have to keep your balance. For high school students, I wouldn't worry about not being able to get into a research lab to do research. Internships or even shadowing can help you learn what it's like in different fields and different careers. If you really want to get a jump on thinking like a scientist and being like a scientist, Remember, the people who started biology didn't have research opportunities and jobs. Really, they went out and like observed birds and bugs, or they learned to troubleshoot or do, the cooking stuff. Any of these things, I totally respect people who come to me and say, I bird watch, I watch birds, I've got this thing, or, I have a job, but it's fixing stuff at this place, or, there's so many ways to prove that you're the kind of person who's responsible, honest, thoughtful, so high school students, don't panic if you don't get in a research lab.
Yeah, I would echo that and just say, I mean, you guys are way ahead of the curve in terms of, where I was as a high school student. And just don't be stressed out if you feel like you haven't completely mapped out the rest of your life right now. That's okay. A lot of us on this panel, had no idea what we were going to be doing now when we were your age.
Yeah, I was going to just echo that. My advice would be that it's not linear. Like, the path is not linear. It's okay if your path takes dips and turns and you think you like something and then realize you're in a lab at some point in time and you don't like that and you switch to another field, or you really think you want to go to med school and then you decide, oh my gosh, that's not right for me, and I chose, to go into research instead. Like, it's okay if your path isn't linear, and don't feel like that is a failure or any reflection on you if your path's not linear, because nobody's path is linear, and I can guarantee that there's always going to be twists and turns. So don't stress if it feels like there's some set way you have to do something. There's not.
And also, just going along with the idea that you did not have to do like research opportunities, to go on this path. But I do know that a lot of fellow students here, including myself, we've been kind of having inquiries on how to, if you do want to get in some action on the field in high school or below grad school, like what would be the best way to step into it? Would it be like to contact someone directly or to go with a program or something like that? So what would your advice be on that?
I could, for instance, I know the different universities, as one of the panelists mentioned, their university, you could just search neuroscience, summer internship for high schoolers, and the different universities have opportunities. As I mentioned, I know there is one at Duke University called the Dunes Summer Research, and that's one is geared towards high school, but you have to live in the Triangle area, and all you need to do is apply, and they select undergrads to do research in different labs. They just match you. So I think most of it is just finding the opportunities. And I don't know if your career advisor or in high school has, point you guys to those type of opportunities. But I mean, you could take it on your own and just search different university websites, and you'll find them.
Yeah, that's amazing advice. Thank you so much. I mean, I know a lot of different people here are interested. So if so it's like 11:26. So I'd like to wrap up our panel today. I had so much fun talking to all of you amazing professors, and to everyone who's attending, thank you for oh yeah, there's a link in the chat. All the links in the chat we'll be posting later, so don't worry if you can't grab it right now. But I want to extend yet another thanks to our amazing, awesome panelists who took time out of their already busy schedules to spend time with us and to enlighten us as to their careers and what that would look like. So, virtual round of applause to them. And thank you to everyone who attended. We are so glad that you are here. I posted a link to our Discord server with more opportunities. If you want to get more involved in the neuro, things like that, we do have stuff and opportunities coming through. And yeah, so I just wanted to wrap up this session with a big thank you to everybody.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and I think it was a really helpful event, and the Neuro hopes to host more of these events in the future with more panelists. So yeah, I hope everyone learned something today. Panelists, thank you so much for sharing and inspiring this group of students. And yeah, thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Have a great day, everyone. We
Thank
enjoyed
you.
having you guys.
Yeah, so if Neuro people want to stay behind.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending.
Bye, guys.